Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and a huge thank you to Chicago Blend for hosting this event and for having me up here. My name is Santiago, and today I'm going to be talking to you about venture studios and why they matter. So, just a little bit of background on me and why I'm up here talking to you about venture studios. I'm a University of Chicago Booth MBA, and most recently I was working at Serac Ventures as a VC fellow through the Chicago Blend Fellowship Program. Before Serac, I was working at 25 Madison, which is a New York-based venture studio, and this is where I got my firsthand experience in venture studios and where I perform most of my research, just trying to figure out what venture studios are, how they work, and why some of them don't work. And it's what we're going to be discussing here today. So before we even get into what a venture studio actually does, I wanted to bring up some of the key points that actually drew me to the asset class in the first place. So when we look at IRRs for traditional startups, the traditional VC returns range anywhere from 20 to 25% on average. But venture studio startups will actually return on average 53% IRRs, which is a 28% alpha generation over traditional startups and is extremely relevant, especially when we consider that a lot of VC funds are not able to generate 50+% IRRs. Even when we look at multiple on invested capital, traditional startups will return on average 1.6 times their money, whereas venture studio startups will return 5.8 times the money, which is, again, very relevant. And when we look at time from launch to Series A, traditional startups will take on average 56 months, while venture studio startups will take less than half that time with just over 2 years at 25 months. Same story goes from zero to seed and from seed to Series A. Venture studio startups can be much more efficient than traditional startups. And now we can get into what a venture studio actually does. And if I had to summarize it, the venture studio essentially generates an idea from zero, incubates it, and then grows it to the point where they can spin it out to another VC, at which point they sort of take a step back and let the founder and the other VCs take the reins. And if we look at a little bit more specifically, it's broken down into four sections. The ideation section, which is where they literally generate the idea from zero, and they have to figure out if there's white space in that industry and if they're able to actually add value. Then they validate that idea. They try to figure out if it's an actual pain point, if people are actually going to use that product, if the experts think that it's actually viable. Then they'll execute on the product by launching it and then iterating on that product to try to make it as good as possible so that eventually they can spin it out. And this just means showing it to other VCs and getting an external investment so they can eventually take a step back and like I mentioned before, sort of let the new VCs and the founding team take the reins from that point on. And the venture studio model correctly might resemble to a lot of you an incubator and accelerator, but there are some very relevant differences. The first one and one of the more relevant ones is the equity share. So while an incubator or an accelerator might take 5 to 10% of a company, the venture studio is going to take a much more relevant portion, anywhere from 20 to 80%. Now, this is relevant because the venture studio takes more of a co-founder or co-owner role with the company, whereas the incubator or the accelerator will take more of a support role where the founder is the one leading the actions and then the incubator and accelerator are supporting them. This also means that the venture studio dedicates considerably more time and employee resources to the companies, while the accelerator and incubator are taking more of a supporting role. And so the incubator and accelerator might support with idea validation or finding product market fit, while the venture studio will help literally from point zero all the way up to the Series A, like I just mentioned. And the model has had a lot of home runs. Here we can see companies like Dollar Shave Club and Hims and Hers that have both in the private and public markets reached unicorn valuations coming through venture studios. Going back to investment returns, a large reason why venture studio startups are able to beat traditional VC funding methods is because of their higher survival rates. So when we look at all startups coming out of venture studios, 84% of those companies are going to make it to a seed round, and 72% of those companies are going to make it to Series A financing. And we can compare that to traditional startups that only make it from Series C to Series A 42% of the time. And when we look at the whole process, 60% of venture studio startups will reach that Series A financing. That means that 6 out of every 10 companies that come out of that venture studio are going to reach Series A. So when we look back at that 30% equity, founders are really trading 30% of their company for a much, much higher chance of success. And we could actually see that venture studio companies generate 3 times more IPOs versus traditional VC funding rounds. But it is important to figure out if that 30% is going to affect the founder down the road. So when you look at your Series A traditional and Series A venture studio cap tables, you can actually see that a lot of the times the Series A studio cap table will have more ownership for the founder. In this case, it's 24% more ownership. And this is in large part because the venture studio investment is able to skip out on a lot of funding rounds, like an angel round, a pre-seed, an accelerator, or even an incubator. And so the way it shakes out, the founder might actually end up with more ownership of the company than if they went the traditional route. And this is particularly important, obviously, for the founder, but also for VCs who are worried that the founder is not going to be incentivized enough to continue running the company if they don't have enough equity ownership. And to better understand the effects that skipping around has on venture studio investments, the folks over at Purpose Built created a Monte Carlo simulation to estimate the expected exit value of the same investment going through venture studio versus traditional VC. And so in the middle, we could see the venture studio effects, where equities typically take 30%, as we had mentioned. They'll skip on average 0.14 rounds, and they improve chance of success through the venture studio by 3% or 0.03. And we can see that on the left side, even though the founder through the venture studio has much less equity, by the time of the exit, the expected exit value is much higher for the founder working with the venture studio, with a 10 million in this case, versus without the venture studio, which is about 7 million. It's also relevant to mention that a lot of the successful venture studios have access to top tier funding. And so this is particularly relevant if you're a founder or a VC who does not have access to these funds, like Founders Fund, NEA, SoftBank, Sequoia, or other top-tier VCs, because you can sacrifice a little bit of equity in your company in order to get access to these top-tier funds and maybe considerably increase the likelihood that your company is going to succeed. And I want to close with some concerns that I've heard people have about venture studio investing during my research. One of the big ones was that it's hard to attract experienced founders, and this can be true. Although I found that once you educate an experienced founder, they'll be much more willing to join a venture studio once they find out about risk mitigation, access to top-tier backing, especially if a founder has experience in a certain industry. For example, if they started a company in industrials, but they want to switch over to healthcare, venture studios can make a really compelling case. So for me, I found that it's less of a concern and more of an education problem. Another concern is cap table complexities, which we've discussed throughout the presentation. Again, it's more of an education problem where VCs feel like venture studios will typically take way too much capital in the cap table, which will create problems down the line, but we've seen that that's not a huge issue. A third issue that I've seen is the hammer and nail problem, where many venture studios are incentivized to produce as many companies as possible, and where they're not able to find a sufficiently good company, they'll become a hammer looking for a nail, where everything becomes a nail. And this is where you kind of have to make sure you're picking the correct venture studios that have diligence and are making sure that they're producing the best companies possible. And finally, because it's a relatively young asset class, there is limited data on the effectiveness of venture studios as an asset class as a whole, even though we have seen pretty attractive results throughout the presentation. So quick recap, why are venture studios important? If you're a VC fund, the combination of high success rates in startups, access to potentially inaccessible top-tier VCs, and a largely untapped market make this a great sourcing mechanism. And if you're a founder, either first time or repeating, or you're looking to switch industries, or you're looking to get access into a top-tier VC, the venture studio model is a great option that might actually end up with you having higher ownership of your company than if you went a traditional VC route. And that's all I have for venture studios. If you have any comments, questions, or if you want to chat about venture studios or about anything else, please feel free to reach out to me using the QR code. I'm more than happy to chat. Thank you so much for your time.